Hello, and welcome to Vow Voices of Wisdom, the show that might not be for everybody, but everybody needs to watch this show. Today, my show is about the Great Migration. And the title of the book that we're going to talk about today is called The Warmth of Other Suns. It's a book that brings to life one of the greatest unreported stories of the 20th century, a migration that reshaped modern America. The author, Isabel Wilkerson, won the Pulitzer Prize for her work as Chicago's New York Times in 1994, making her the first Black woman in the history of American journalism to win this prize and the first African American to win the individual reporting. Wilkerson has also won the George Polk Award, and she was named Journalist of the Year in the National Association of Black Journalists. She also has spoken on many topics, as we're going to talk about today, of migration, social justice, urban affairs, and 20th century history at universities across the country and in Europe. And today I have my special guest who's going to help me talk about this great migration that many people do not know, and we learned so much from this book. Today, my guest today is Audrey Gaines. Welcome, Audrey.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me to discuss the warmth of other suns.
Yes, tell us a little bit about your background and who you are.
Well, my background is that I am a social worker. I am retired for 2 years from the town of East Hampton. I was then the director of youth services. I am a licensed clinical social worker, and I'm in private practice at this moment. And I enjoy cultural functions and enjoy being involved with cultural settings and all kinds of wonderful things that happen when you work and when you're doing cultural, research.
Yes.
I am proud to say that I am on, a member of the Eastville Historical Society, and where they're doing a lot of work and where we discuss,
And
authors.
that's why I wanted to have you on the show, because you narrated or you gave a presentation about this book, and I was invited to come, and it was such a great dialogue we had. So this is why I want to have you on my show, because you did such a great job, and I thought it was such an interesting topic. So I felt like a lot of people don't know, Audrey, about this great migration.
Absolutely.
And I believe Isabel Wilkerson did just a tremendous job on this book. And if anyone get a chance, I suggest you read it and get it and pass it on. It's a very, very good book. She talked about, she interviewed more than like 1,200 people, I'm told. And we're going to just talk about maybe three of the people that we're going to kind of point out that she talked about. So the first one we want to talk about is Ida Mae Gladney. That's her name. I think that's her name.
Yeah.
And tell us a little bit about what you remember about her and that we express in the book.
Okay. First, I just want to tell you a little, too. I first ran across this book at a book discussion of myself. And
okay.
So when I first picked up this book, I said, gee, this is a huge, book to read. Do I want to read this?
Yeah.
And so as I started reading it, and I said, oh, my goodness, it's such a interesting book, and I can relate to it, to the book itself, very much. So that's how discussing it.
I guess we should regroup and just give a point of what is the Great Migration.
Well, the Great Migration, if people don't know, is that when African Americans left the South and migrated to the North, to a new world, they called it, as far as they were concerned, because they were at this point, seeking freedom. so to speak.
Right,
And
right.
that, we can get into later, but they were actually seeking a better way of life.
Because, I mean, it was slavery.
Absolutely.
It was
And
hanging. It was killing. I mean, people who've watched my show know I go there. And that's the whole point of this. They left, a lot of them left to save their lives and their families' lives.
to be free.
To be free.
To be free.
To be free.
And I could see that by even speaking with my own mother and father about the South and what they endured, and some of my other relatives that were from, that lived in the South and that eventually migrated to the North. And you could see they were seeking freedom, a new way of life. So getting back to what the original question you asked me about Ida Mae Gladney, who left Mississippi during the very harsh times of living there and having to take all kinds of insults and not really kind of accepting it, and this is a way of life, and having to work very hard, and one of the industries in the South then was picking cotton.
Right, right.
So there weren't, and that was, exactly what a lot of people did. And my own parents did that work as well. And I know if, with my mother saying it was a back-breaking, job that they had to do for little or no money.
Right, right.
So
right.
Ida Mae left Mississippi during that migration time to seek a new way of life. And I believe she went to, I think, Minnesota or one of these other places that she eventually went to. But then she left there and they went to, if you know, they went to Chicago.
Right, right,
And lived in Chicago and met up with some very hard times in Chicago, where there were eventually one of the biggest race riots there was, actually, living in places where you weren't supposed to, because if you moved in with, in a neighborhood that were, and the neighborhood that she moved into, one of the neighborhoods that she eventually, that she and her husband moved to, was a neighborhood that had other ethnic groups in there that had migrated as well.
Right,
to,
right.
To the great city of Chicago.
Right.
And when they, they saw them as a threat. I mean, and eventually, they won their case of living, in that neighborhood. They won, they went back, but then they were eventually thrown out. The place was set afire. I mean, all kinds of things happened. And I believe she worked at Campbell's soup factory and so forth. But she really struggled, and that's what I see with a lot of.
And it's interesting because I also want to point out the time frame of this whole migration was, I understand it was from like 1915 to 1970.
Absolutely.
I think that's just mind-boggling to me, like 55 years of this.
Yeah.
And just to get to a better life,
Yeah.
And I remember, I believe also Ida Mae actually voted for Barack when he became senator.
Yeah.
I remember that was mentioned in the book.
Yeah.
So I thought that was interesting that was mentioned in the book, that she got, because where she came from, just the thought of voting, I mean, that alone, for her to say that, to hear that people could vote, she was saying, she didn't think she could, but that she, she had the right to vote. And here she was now in a position where she could vote.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, for some reason, Audrey, it just boggles my mind to think that people were treated this way and didn't have the right to vote.
That's the whole thing. They didn't vote. There were signs always up that, they were black, they were white, you had to go where you ever, that's where, things were. I mean, it was accepted as a way of life and a harsh way of life. And getting back to Ida Mae, she and her husband, if you remember, had to, they contemplated whether or not they should tell.
If they were going to leave, that's right.
If they should tell the person that her husband worked for, if they should leave. They had, like, misgivings about doing that because someone had wanted to leave and was beaten
Right.
because they
Right.
you know,
Right.
that they left the employment. And I mean, imagine
And it's funny.
having to be under that kind of you know, rule that you would have to be beaten and you were afraid to tell someone that you were leaving.
It's so funny when you said employment, it almost kind of like, it's fun. It's not, I'm not going to use the word funny, but it's almost like it really can't even compare it almost to employment.
Absolutely not.
It was slavery.
Yeah.
You know, they were supposedly free, but they were, you know, under a lot of, or not free, you know?
Not free.
So it was a lot of stuff going on there. And then to think that you were afraid to leave, you know, because they were knowing that people were being killed.
Well, when people would leave at some points, what Isabel Wilkerson research was that when people left, sometimes they left those jobs. The boss man came looking for them.
Right, that's right.
And if they came looking for them, they would drag them back.
That's right. That's
so
crazy.
It was really, you know, very scary times for them.
I want the audience to hear what we're saying and how in-depth this was, you know?
Absolutely.
They're talking about cruel and inhuman treatment.
And really, and you didn't know that your parents lived in such fear of their lives.
Right.
And that's why all the migration to this new world, to the north, to, you know, that Chicago, California, where else can, you know, New York, you know, that people just migrated in numbers. And I mean, millions of people migrated from those, you know, from the South.
It's funny, I was thinking of, too, when Ida Mae came to the North, they didn't have the white and black signs, but it was almost, at one point she experienced like an invisible sign.
Oh, yeah.
Like they weren't there,
yeah.
but they were there because she was still feeling that. It might not have been as harsh, but she still was dealing with that issue. You know, and the next person we'll talk about is George Storling.
Yes.
Now, he, you know, give us a little bit of information about this gentleman.
George was very clever. He had an idea that he really wanted to go to school, that he wanted an education. And he lived in Florida. And his whole thing is that if he could just go and get an education, he could teach school. And he was very involved. And he started going, but it didn't last. Money was an issue, so he couldn't go on. He was very, very clever in organizing organizing people who were working on the orange groves. And these people were working in the orange groves, picking oranges, and for a overseer, as they called him, an overseer, you know, like a manager or whatever you want. And what would happen is they were working for
pennies. Ridiculous.
They were working for nothing. And they were working as slaves. They were working, you know, to make ends meet. Well, George had this fantastic idea after he left school, because there's a whole thing about him leaving. He left school. I mean, he wanted his father. His father said couldn't pay for it. His father had remarried. There was a whole bunch of stuff that happened in between that. But he organized these grove workers to take them. He would take them every morning. They would go to some grove and they'd pick oranges, and they sent him directly to the places that made juices, you know, and they would get paid more money for their you know, work. Well, I think the sheriff, whoever he was, caught on to it, and George had to run for his life.
Absolutely.
He had to run. He had to leave the state of Florida and head to New York, where he had relatives in New York. And he was very instrumental when he came to New York, because he, I think he got a job as a porter on a
On the train.
on the train.
Yeah.
One of your big trains. I can't remember the name of that
Mm-hmm.
train, but Cannonball or whatever
Mm-hmm.
that would go into Florida. You
Right,
know,
right.
of course, he never made. His relatives would come and visit him at a, you know, when he would got to Florida at a particular place, they would travel 2 miles to come and
Yeah,
see him.
yeah,
But
yeah.
he was quite an activist, and
Yes,
he,
absolutely.
you know, he really worked very hard and became involved. He even there was in Birmingham when the church burned down. You know, when they set the church afire and those children were killed in Birmingham.
Right.
He went and collected money to give to the NAACP to, you know, help to restore. And it was very little money, but it was so important that he would go around and collect money to send for that particular, you know, project that they were rebuilding the church. But
He was just an advocate by birth. It just appeared.
he was,
Because I thought it was so strong how he stood up, you know, during the time when there was, you know, in the orange picking. But it was also kind of interesting how some of the people were afraid to stand up with him, and even it shared that some people even you know, told on him or you know didn't go with him. Was afraid because they were afraid of their jobs.
Yeah.
In the meantime, he was trying to get them to say, if we all come together, they won't have nobody to pick these oranges, so they'll have to give us money. I think sometimes they did take a stand and they did get the extra money, but for the most part, a lot of them was afraid to take that stand.
And he felt the sting, Brenda, of racism, and he really wanted to. Why are we working like this? Why are we, you know, he questioned that, you know, that very thing that we didn't, you know, have to live like this.
Exactly.
You know,
he took a stand.
He took a stand, and that was an important thing for him, that he never gave up on that, you know, that he had that instinct inside of himself.
And before I forget, I thought it was very interesting and how we could relate how certain people from certain areas went certain places. We were saying how Ida Mae, she was from Mississippi, she went to Chicago. And then George was in Florida, and he went to New York. And we think even in Virginia, North Carolina, where a lot of us are from, you know, our parents are from, came to New York. And so like what we said, we could relate so much of this book. But that's one thing that just hit me. I was like, oh my God, I can relate to that for real, you know?
I know. And so he had relatives, and a lot of us had relatives that were already here, that we could, you know.
And that's what happened generally, right?
Yes.
Some would leave, and then little by little.
Family would, it's the same thing that happens today. And you see the migration, you know, of other groups moving, and they're coming because I have an uncle, I have an aunt, I have, you know, sister, brother, whoever lives here already.
That's true.
So, you know, we come and settle, you know, and this is where we come. It's the same thing. But this was such a great migration of African American people to the North that it's never been taught. It just seems like no one ever thought about it. Oh, they just moved here and blah, blah, blah. They never really knew how people got here, but a lot of people that we know today, we are that generation of people, you know, that know how they, you know, a lot of people came here.
Absolutely, absolutely. The last person we're going to talk about is Mr. Robert Foster.
Dr. Robert.
Dr. Robert Foster.
This is funny because the South didn't, he comes from Louisiana. And he left Louisiana, you know, he had lived there and was educated. He was very educated. He had a father that was a principal of a school, if I remember that. He had a brother that became a doctor as well, but was perfectly satisfied living in, you know, in Louisiana and having to deal with the racism that he faced there. Then it was that he went off to the army, I believe, at some point, you know, and he faced a lot of racism in the military, and I think he went to Germany or one of the, you know, places, and and worked in the hospitals there, but was never really recognized
Right.
for what he could do.
Exactly.
He was supposedly a very good surgeon.
Absolutely.
And he lived, and I think he lived in Atlanta for a while, and he married a woman from that was a very, you know, prestigious,
right,
well-to-do.
right,
You know,
right.
her father was, I think her father taught at Morehouse,
Right,
UNI
right,
Morehouse,
right,
yeah.
right.
And you know, after he got married, his whole thing was that, you know, I'm out of here. I've got to get out of the South. I mean, I think he felt it too, that a lot of the racism is just like, I can't take this.
Yeah,
I just want to leave this place
Right,
behind,
right.
which a lot of people have. You know, when they've left the South, they haven't really, you know, African Americans, some of them like, no, I don't want to go back. My father being one, I don't know if he visited as much as my mother,
Right.
but, you know, that there's that, I don't want to deal with it anymore.
Right, right.
I want to get out of here.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was his whole attitude, is leaving. And when he left, he traveled to California. But
He
was,
just had a bend that he had to go to California. Whatever.
everybody was living in he had friends in California, and you've got to come to California. You haven't lived till you've come to, you know, been to California. Well, I think he got a little bit of a crude awakening
Yes,
when he got there, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
So
Let's talk a little bit about, just a little bit about what happened when he couldn't
his
find
travels.
hotels.
Oh, his
He
traveling.
couldn't find a place to live. I mean, to sleep. They wouldn't let him sleep in the hotels.
Absolutely.
That's
Absolutely. That traveling, that whole traveling to California was an experience within itself,
Right,
because
right.
he encountered so much racism.
Yes,
He
yes.
could not stay at hotels. And, you know, which reminds me, that's one of the things that our families did, because we couldn't stay in hotels. We couldn't like leave and like, I'm going to stay in this hotel and that hotel.
Right.
You know, there were problems. And so they set up little places where you could go and
stop.
you know, and stop. But he encountered trying to stay in some of these hotels. They would look at him and say, no, you can't stay here.
And I also thought it was so interesting when he finally got there and established himself. It's just a twist that I want to make a point of, how even some of his own people wouldn't go to him as a doctor, because they felt that they've arrived now. They can now have the privilege to have a white doctor. And I thought that was such a twist of everything, that here he was now finally become you know, he's a doctor, he's a great doctor, but some of his own people he grew up with that moved there wouldn't come to him.
Isn't that astonishing?
It is. It
and
really
that
is.
happens today a lot, because people, don't, you know, they won't go to that person because, you know, they're black. I'm not going to go there. I'd rather, you know, deal with the white person, because
Like
they probably
supposed to be
know
better.
they're better. They know more.
Does
you
that
know.
think sometime, is that you think that's some sort of a brainwashing thing too, or is something about that whole thing with, you know?
Well, you and I spoke about how that we thought that had a lot to do with it, you know, even probably the self-esteem of some,
right. And being belittled like that, and over years and years and years of that fear and that, you know, pushing down of who you are, it has to affect you after a while. It has to affect your psyche after a while, you know? We have like 3 minutes left, and what I wanted to talk about now is how far have we come at this point, you think, from there? And what I was going to quickly read is, first of all, I want to read quickly. It says, in 1963, the march had been called the most magnificent demonstration of interracial unity that this nation had ever seen. Of course, that was the march that they did in 1963. And the civil rights and the freedoms and rights that people has a member of a community, a state. This is what civil rights was, the definition was. Civil rights as the freedom and rights that a person has as a member of a community, state, and nation. In the U.S., these rights are guaranteed in all citizens by the Constitution and the acts of Congress. And the theme of that march was jobs, justice, and peace. So let's talk a little bit about the housing that's going on now, and the education, and even the voting. Nothing's too much has changed, I don't think.
It seems like many of these issues that you spoke about, some of these issues on housing and voting and education, some of it has reversed now, is going back, and especially around the voting issue, that we see that as really a big thing.
Yes.
And,
yes.
Can everybody vote, and it's why are we going back to that same kind of, stand that we had, before, where the march was for voters' rights, for the freedom, and for the, being able to be accepted, as equal. How unbelievable it is that we were citizens, African Americans were citizens. This country was built on their blood, sweat, and tears.
Yes.
And they were here when people first became, when there was a first establishment of people being here, in this whole country. So then why are they looked on as second-class citizens?
And and even now, we're going to have like 30 seconds left. I wish we had a little bit more time.
Yes.
To even talk about, even now it's being told, we're going to talk about this election that's coming up now. There's people that are putting money into making voting restrictions and doing all kinds of things to avoid people from, voting, having a difficulty voting. And this is almost like going backwards,
Absolutely.
And I don't have time to read. Maybe I do have a little bit of time to read this. But this was an article I found December 2007. It said the economic consequences of Mr. Bush. The next president will have, this is December 2007, mind you, the next president will have to deal with yet another crippling legacy of George W. Bush, the economy. Then it says, when you look back on some day at this catastrophe, that the use that was the Bush administration will think of many things, the tragedy of Iraq, the shame of Guatemala, and it talks about how the damage done in American economical does not make the front page every day, but the repercussions will be felt beyond the lifetime of anyone reading this page. That was in 2007. So time is up. Thank you so much. I wish we had more time, but get out and vote. It's your right. It's your privilege. You have a good day.